Thank you, Tess. We appreciate it. Well, welcome to the September 21st, 2023 meeting of the Business Operations Committee of the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission. Before we begin, I want to recognize Ashley Thomas to provide a statement of necessity for today's meeting. Ashley?
Thank you, Commissioner. This is Ashley Thomas, General Counsel for the Commission. This committee meeting includes an option for the public's participation via a link available on the Commission's website. TCA 844-108 allows for a governing body to allow participation by electronic means of communication where a physical quorum is not present, or is not possible, As committee business requires a decision prior to the regularly scheduled October meeting, the necessity of electronic participation is for the committee's deliberation and action on items as set forth in the September 21st, 2023 agenda. All votes of the committee shall be by roll call. This meeting is being recorded, and a statement of necessity shall be filed with the Secretary of State after its conclusion.
Thank you, Ashley. Hayden, please take a roll call, commissioners.
Commissioner Smith, Commissioner Woodson.
Here.
Commissioner Carter.
Present.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Are there any questions or comments from commissioners before we begin? Okay, there being none, the Business Operation Committee will consider 3 items on the agenda today. First, we will hear the Executive Director's operational update from Tess. Then the Commissioner's Director of Finance and Operation, Melanie, will present budget updates, including the fiscal year 2024 budget to actuals, fiscal year 2024 grant status, and an update to the fiscal year 2025 budget requests. Finally, Tess and Melanie will present an overview of the TISA. Do we have any questions or comments on the agenda before we vote to approve? Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion to approve.
And who is that made by?
Jamie Woodson.
Jamie, is there a second? Can I have a second?
I think that might be you, Mr. Chairman, since Eddie's not here.
Second the motion then. Hayden, please take a roll call.
Commissioner Woodson.
Aye.
Chairman Carter.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, that's 2 ayes, 0 noes.
The ayes have it and the agenda is approved. The minutes of the meeting held on July 27th, 2023 have been provided. Does anyone have any comments or edits to make regarding the prior minutes before we proceed? Is there a motion to approve the? Excuse me.
This is Commissioner Jamie Woodson. No comments or question, and move to approve.
Is there a second? I'll second. Hayden, please take a roll call.
Commissioner Woodson.
Aye.
Chairman Carter.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have ayes.
Approved. The first item on our agenda is an operational update from our Executive Director, Tess. Tess, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair Carter. And I am excited to provide a brief update of kind of operational items over the last couple of months. First, I am thrilled to share that as of Monday, September 25th, the commission is fully staffed. We have hired a grants coordinator who is starting on the 25th. Noelle Farley, and that completes all of the staffing positions that we have allocated. So just thrilled at where we are from a staff capacity perspective, thrilled with our new team members, and excited for commissioners to get an opportunity to meet all of our new team members in our October meeting. We also requested additional cubicles as it relates to our staff growth in our office space. And actually today they are installing those cubicles. And we've already factored in the cost of the cubicles and the rent into our FY24 budget. So Melanie will be able to share more about how we're accommodating that increase in rent and cubicle space as it relates to our budget. And finally, we did have one procurement activity that will need this committee's consideration and vote of approval. Over the last couple months, we did execute a contract with Kelly Croneman, who was previously a staff member of the commission. And then we worked with Central Procurement to move her into a consultant role. She has been supporting new team members in the areas of special populations as they come on board, get grounded in the work, and also supporting schools in getting their services to special populations going with the new school year. Under the procurement procedures of the commission, the executive director is allowed to execute a contract if it's time sensitive, but then bring that contract to the commission at a later date at its next meeting for consideration and ultimate sign off on that contract. So my ask of this committee is to recommend approval of the Kelly's contract at the next commission meeting. And with that, I turn it back over to the chair for any questions.
Thank you, Tess. Are there any additional questions for Tess? There being none, do we have a motion to approve the contract?
Motion to approve the contract. This is Jamie Woodson.
Thank you, Jamie. I'll second. Hayden, please take a roll call.
Commissioner Woodson,
Aye.
Chairman Carter,
Aye. The
Mr.
ayes
Chairman.
have it. The contract is now approved. The next item on our agenda today are updates for the commission's budget to actuals from fiscal year 24, fiscal year 24 grant status, and fiscal year budget request from the Director of Finance and Operations, Melanie. Melanie, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair Carter, and hopefully everybody can hear me. Can you? Thank you. Okay, I was having some WebEx issues this morning, so apologize that I'm not on camera. As far as our FY24 budget to actual, so thus far, since this meeting is happening a little bit earlier in the fall, we have very few expenditures to report thus far, but we have provided the committee with an update on about the first 6 weeks of our expenditures of the fiscal year. That is what had closed up until that point. I think one update that I'm excited to share with the committee since our last meeting and since these materials were prepared is that as part of our growth, as Tess mentioned, we have built out new cubicles, and those are, I think, hopefully being set up this morning, sort of as we speak, which is very exciting. But we do know that that will increase our rent costs a bit from where it was. So we will be updating the committee next meeting on where sort of the costs from that project shake out. Again, this is fully built in within our budget authority currently. We don't anticipate having any issues, but we will be updating that projection for the committee as we get some final information about the costs associated with that build out. But a very exciting time for the commission. With that, I'm happy to take any questions specifically about the budget to actuals that anybody has at this time.
Thank you, Melanie. Are there any additional questions from the commissioners? Again, I want to thank you, Melanie, for keeping us updated on the commission's finances. Finally, we have an overview of the TISA presented by Tess and Melanie. Tess and Melanie, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chair Carter. And Melanie, if it's helpful, I can share on my screen the PowerPoint. And then if you want to just cue me when you want to, we should flip slides. Does that work?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, Melanie, you're ready to go.
Thank you. All right, so I know at our last meeting, there were some questions specifically about TISA, how TISA is shaking out for our schools and sort of what implementation for us has looked like so far. So I'm going to give an overview, both a little bit of a background information about what is TISA, what does that include when we talk about TISA, what actual revenue are we talking about, as well as just a snapshot of how this looks for our schools thus far. And then as well as addressing some challenges that are out there, both for us and for the charter sector as a whole. Tess, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide for me. So under TISA and state board rule, state and local funding allocation are calculated for charter schools in really 3 distinct steps. So when we talk about TISA, that is Really, though, I, like many other people, use that interchangeably with all the state and local funds that flow to schools. It is really only sort of the initial portion of funding that charter schools receive, both from us and from any local geographic LEAs as well. So when we talk about TISA funding, we're talking about the base funding, which is about $6,700 per student roughly, plus the weighted additional funding that is based on prior year student characteristics, plus any additional direct funding allocations that are appropriated by the legislature each year. And so when in the spring, our schools began receiving, and we as a district began receiving information from the department that said, based on the student characteristics for your school this year, the unique learning needs that your students have, the count of those students, as well as any other direct funding allocation, here is a TISA projection so far. And those were updated regularly until the final snapshots of the TISA funding were determined. There are additional local contribution funds that our schools receive as what we in the department sometimes call step 2. So TISA has both a state funding component and a local required match. Anything that a local funding body contributes to their LEA above and beyond that is considered an additional local contribution above what is the minimum required by TISA. So that is the per pupil average of local additional funds allocated by the geographic LEA's funding body. Step 3 is a current year true up, and that reflects the changes in the charter school's membership. So if a charter school loses kids, they can lose the per pupil PPA, and if they gain kids, they will gain some average daily membership. So Tess, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about step 1 funding. So again, this is when we talk about what is actually included in TISA. Technically, there are 2 different funding components. There is the state funding, and there is the required local match from the local districts. The required local match is determined based on an annual fiscal capacity calculation for that county. So the proportion of total TISA funding that a district may get or a county may get can be quite different based on their fiscal capacity. Some districts are receiving about 80% of their funding from the state and have a required local match that only makes up about 20% of their total funding. And for some districts that have a higher fiscal capacity at the local level, it may be the opposite of that. And so that is sort of the first step of how the actual revenue flows in TISA funding. Tess, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So when we got our final FY24 allocation, I want to give the committee an example of what this looked like. So we had the little over $6,800 in base funding that was multiplied by our ADM last year. You can see for our unique learning needs, our economically disadvantaged weight, a very transparent calculation of how our TISA funds are generated. So our sort of step 1 funding as a district is about $43 million for this year. And again, since that is entirely based on prior year enrollment, that portion of the funding does not change. So that calculation, once it is set around about July, it doesn't change for the rest of the year because at that point, the calculation is final. If you want to go ahead and go to step 2. On step 2, the additional local contribution, this is where there is a much greater amount of variance for both our schools and for charters across the sector. So when we and the TDOE calculate the additional local per pupil, you're looking at the difference between the LEA's actual revenue to the district at the geographic level, less their required match under TISA. So that generates initially a projected additional local fund. And then at the end of the year, there will be actuals of those local funds. And then that is divided by the ADM or the enrollment of all schools within the geographic LEA's bounds. So this is what this looks like for Davidson County. is a calculation of additional local funds based on the prior year enrollment and the charter school ADM. So for our schools, based on our initial projected funding, we received an about roughly additional $13.8 million for our Davidson County schools based on that local contribution. I will say there has been a great deal of confusion about this that I know that we have heard across the sector, but particularly for our Davidson County schools. As you can see, that is a substantial portion of funding that comes from that additional local contribution. And because of that, it is a very important calculation. Fundamentally, this sort of divide between what was under the BEP, what was an additional local contribution, and then the true up is not actually a new process under TISA. It's a different funding formula underneath it, but that actual process is not any different. But what we do know is that there's a much more transparency under TISA, which I think has led to questions across the sector. So the initial portion of this allocation is also initially allocated to charter schools based on their prior year ADM. So for a fully built out school, their first 3 payments under TISA each month will be based initially on their prior year ADM. Tess, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. So the last step is current year adjustments. And this is also not something that is new this year, but the underlying formula that drives it is slightly different. So for new and expanding charter schools, they obviously have no prior year data, or their prior year data does not capture their full enrollment. So new and expanding charter schools are initially funded for their new enrollment based on projections that are based on the projected per pupil amount for the geographic LEA. So that per pupil rate is based on all of the state and local funding received by the geographic LEA, both the, if we want to call it the TISA step 1 portion, and the projected additional local contribution for the geographic LEA. That is divided by the total ADM and then multiplied by the projected additional growth for an expanding school or the new growth for an entirely new school. So again, that first round of payments up through October is based on projections, and it's still based on a per pupil average. I think this is something that a lot of people had some misconceptions by, that current year adjustments would be made based on student characteristics. They're not. They are based on a per pupil average of all state and local funding from the geographic LEA. Charter school funding allocations are then trued up to their current year ADM in October, February, and June. So this is still the same process as it was under the BEP in previous years. There is what is called an ADM true up 3 different times during the school year. And that is where they capture sort of their full enrollment funding. But we do know, just like under BEP, these true-ups can result in positive or negative adjustments from schools. If you lose enrollment, you are losing the full per pupil rate for an average student in that geographic LEA. If you have a net increase in enrollment, then you will receive a positive adjustment based on that rate. But I think we have heard some confusion about people think that, there may be a world in which we would be reducing based on an individual student's characteristics. And that's not the case. Under state board rule, this is also based on a weighted per pupil average. Tess, we can go to the next slide. So when we look at our schools and how TISA affected them, this is a chart that shows what the 22-23 per pupil average for each school in our portfolio last year was, and what if you turn their total TISA payments into a per pupil by the school, what that looks like this year. So you can see pretty uniformly across the district, all of our schools are receiving more money under TISA. This is also not particularly surprising because there's more money that's been put into the system under TISA. But what you will see is that before, the only variance for our schools and the amount that they were getting paid depended on where they sat in the state. And now there is variance across all of our schools in what their amount of funding is. So for example, Rocket Ship Dream Community Prep is receiving a PPA of $16,480, while KIPP Antioch College Prep Elementary received $16,304. Those schools are pretty much down the street from each other, but receive slightly different PPA weights. There is a greater difference, obviously, still between Shelby County and between Davidson County, but we do also see that there is more variance between our schools and their comparison to the weighted per pupil average for the local district. So I've put those in the notes at the bottom. The MSCS average across all students across the district is a little over $12,000. Some of our schools are receiving above that average. Some of our schools are receiving slightly less than that average. And the Davidson County average is about $15,800. Same thing. One of the things that I do also want to point out for the committee is that elementary schools have more opportunities to receive eligible direct allocations. So there is funding that is part of the TISA formula for things like third grade reading, for tutoring. And so that also drives why you tend to see elementary schools have a higher per pupil average than a middle school or a high school. There's greater sort of funding built into the system this year that helps increase their PPA. I will pause there just to see if anybody has any initial questions before moving on, because I know I've been covering a lot of information.
You're good, Melanie. Please continue.
Okay. Tess, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So some of the challenges that we see for us as a district and for our schools is the timeline for geographic LEAs around when they're required to report their revenue. So when we look at, again, knowing that that additional local contribution makes up a substantial portion of particularly our Davidson schools, but all of our schools' funding, that is dependent in large part on when revenue is being reported by the geographic LEAs to the department. So there is sort of an initial submission to the comptroller's office that happens now in July under TISA that set the base geographic LEA's revenue and anticipated revenue for the year. That transparently caught some of our schools by surprise in Davidson County. It was lower on that initial submission for the comptroller's office than had initially been anticipated. There is no other opportunity that a geographic LEA is reporting their revenue information until they submit what's called their state funds budget to the department October 1st. So every district in the state submits a state funds budget via ePlan. That is sort of the official reporting that is done to the TDOE about what their anticipated revenue and expenditures are for the year. That is the first time that that information is sort of officially reported. And that is when there will be both a revenue adjustment, if applicable, if there has been a change to the budget from what was submitted to the comptroller's office in July. We'll see both a revenue adjustment and an ADM adjustment that happens in October. This can get to why it can be so tricky for us to project our revenue with a high degree of certainty, because there are sort of two targets that can be moving at the same time. One is the local revenue amounts, both budgeted and then actuals, and the other is budgeted ADM, projected ADM versus actual ADM. So those two true-up processes are happening simultaneously. At the same time that the state funds budget is being submitted to the department, the prior year state funds, what's called the state FER, is also submitted to the department on October 1st. So until that October 1st every year, there is no final expenditure reporting of the actual amount of revenue that a geographic LEA received in the prior year. So when we are talking about FY23, so school year 22-23, we will not have the final revenue amounts that either Shelby County or Memphis Shelby County schools or Davidson County schools received until that October 1 deadline. So what this means for us as a district and for our schools is a delayed final true up for the prior fiscal year. So I know we've talked about this the whole time I've been working with the commission. Every year, we know that there are some delays in the timing of that final true up because it requires both that final information to be reported, the department to calculate the amount that is owed between all of the applicable districts, us and MNPS, MSCS, and the ASD as well as part of that final true up calculation. And that can lead to substantial delays. So sometimes we still hear from our schools, hey, we got paid for our schools under MNPS X amount, and you only paid us X amount. What gives, for lack of a better term? And that is all to do with the timing of the true up. MNPS gets their revenue information much more frequently than we do as a statewide LEA, and then the department does. So we have no ability to be trued up by the department on anything other than those different reporting windows for their revenue. And so until that final true up happens after the submission of the state funds FER, there can be a discrepancy in what we are paying our schools or have paid our schools and what may have been paid under a different authorizer. After that true up, there should be parity between the two districts. Everybody should be getting the same amount, but that can take time and also requires us to have potentially checks cut to us for quite a bit of money and to make sure that everything is finalized with both the geographic LEAs and the department in time. There is also sometimes a challenge in that there can be some nuance to how additional revenue calculations work by district. There are certain deductions and things that different districts have in the way that their funding flows to them. There are different rebates, for example, that they may have to give to a different tax entity that can be removed from those revenue calculations under the statute. Debt service amounts can vary greatly. And so what that means is that when we talk sometimes to other people across the sector, there can still be some mistrust or concern about how the geographic LEA is calculating that additional revenue piece and some of the nuances of that. I think sometimes we all hope that these things will be a little bit more straightforward than they actually are. And so sometimes more often than not, when people are asking us questions about those calculations, the answer is it's complicated. And so because of the additional focus on local revenue, the appropriations process for local revenue from the county commissions, that has led to a greater visibility of some of the nuances for how additional revenue is calculated and how it's funded by county commissions or local funding bodies into the geographic LEA.
Hey, Melanie,
Yes.
this is Eddie. So one thing is, just as I've been listening to you, and this may be something that we want to think about for Hayden to have just in his arsenal. You know, I think it would be good if we could see, again, one of the things that the General Assembly keeps asking is, when are we going to be self-sufficient? But listening to you, you know, you're still working on 22-23. We're in the 23-24, and we're getting ready to start the budget process for 24-25. So I think just making sure that we had kind of like a clear timeline of how long it actually takes on paper so that they know we're working towards it, but it's not as cut and dry as you're going to get it by this date, because here are the factors and things that are depending on that.
Yes, absolutely. And I know we have certainly had you know, different versions of that conversations with our partners in the General Assembly, and we'll continue to do that because again, you know, the answer to this is that it's complicated, and it's sort of doubly complicated for us given our unique context. I do also think something that when we think about our authorizer fee projections, I know we've talked about this as a committee before, but I think it's important to remember that because of how delayed our final true up is as a district with the geographic LEAs, there is no ability for us to assess any authorizer fee off of any funding that flows through that final true up. So this year, I think it was close to, or I say this year, our most recent true up, which was actually for FY22, was about $2.5 million in checks that were sent to us from the geographic LEAs. There is no ability because state books for the relevant fiscal years are already long closed by the time we're receiving checks from geographic LEAs for us to assess any authorizer fee on that final trued up amount. So there is sort of because of that delay, it's a little painful for both us and for the schools, but there is also basically a savings built in to our authorizer fee so long as it still becomes that the geographic LEA owes us money. Because at that point, we have no mechanism to assess an authorizer fee on that trued up amount.
Melanie, I have a separate question, so I want to make sure I'm not tripping on Eddie. Eddie, did you get what you needed?
I did. It was more just, I want to make sure that we've got information to be able to show that on a piece of paper to the assembly, because again, I don't think they understand. I can tell you, I never understood the complexity of all of this. When you talk about, the books are closed, we can't do when we do the final true up, we can't draw money down. So I just want to make sure they understand that full picture of why it's taken a little bit more time than we might have originally hoped.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great flag, and we will certainly keep that within our conversations.
Well, and I think we need to be, this is Chris Richards, I think we need to be in a position, we are likely to reach a point where we would be self-sufficient if we got the true up for all of the monies that we actually administered, but because we can't do that because the books have closed, that's going to complicate the discussion in a year where we actually meet our goal to be self-sufficient, but we may not do it because we can't use that last bit of money to get our authorizer fee.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, as we think about, that's sort of the final piece, but of course, us trying to project our authorizer fee amount, the last bullet, is always very difficult because of just how much variance there is in all of the underlying numbers that are used for the calculation. So our enrollment, our schools and the schools enrollment, the total geographic LEAs enrollment, and then also the revenue. All of those are moving numbers that are changing over time, which also gets to when we think about, how close are we to self-sufficiency? We're talking in a range, not absolutes.
And a quick question, this is a kind of more micro, first a comment. Tess and Melanie both so impressed with our ability as a team to understand and shift. TISA is, we've been working under the BEP for a very long time, even 2.0. And so just the shift and knowledge of the team is impressive. Appreciate this tutorial for us. Thing one, we had in our last convening in Memphis, I think it was one of our principals highlighted this a challenge related to classification of students for economic disadvantaged, and proposed the challenge and proposed a solution. Challenge was, SNAP benefits are tricky because students are transient, parents are transient, and those benefits follow the parent versus the child. And she had suggested considering using the TennCare benefits, which follow the child, is a more accurate way to calculate economic disadvantaged in the new TISA formula. One, I want to just wonder, is that something that's resolved? Is that still something in conversation with the department, or is that still just a TBD based on, and by the way, I'm not sure that the TennCare latch would actually work, but it certainly sounded like a great something to consider for a more accurate number.
Yes, absolutely. I do know there have been conversations about that. I am not aware, and Tess, feel free to jump in if you've heard anything more recent than I do of anything new to report on that front. But I do know that's something that we have heard is being discussed at the department level, but certainly not anything that I would anticipate in a short term being changed, or even necessarily a midterm. I think for our schools, transparently, what we see, and I'm sure not just us, other districts see, is that identifying students on what benefits they receive is sort of shockingly difficult. Again, things that seem like they should be easy are typically a little bit more complicated than you would imagine. So something that, I think most of us know is that as a district, as a school, you cannot require a social security number for enrollment. You may request it, but you cannot require it. And depending on which school you are in, you may have more people that opt to provide that information, and you may have fewer people that opt to provide that information. Without a social security number, there is a lot of ability to actually not even be able to find students that may be receiving benefits that they have. If there's any difference in spelling of a name, for example, there's a space somewhere that's not in the TMAC entry system, that can affect your ability to be able to accurately find a student. So something that Lawrence and Sophie on our team work really closely with our schools on is helping them gain some expertise and being able to navigate finding students, particularly students when you do not have a social security number for them. And so we work with some different pathways for our schools to be able to sort of most effectively look for that information to try to identify as many students as they possibly can. But that is a real challenge that comes with, on the data side, is actually just being able to properly identify students that are receiving whether it be TennCare benefits or SNAP benefits off of that data, particularly when you don't have a social security number.
Well, thank you. I look forward to hearing how it plays out, because given the student population that we serve, I would suspect that we have a deflated economic disadvantage number currently, and that'll mean pretty significant resources to support students. So just look forward to hearing how that conversation evolves and appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I'm happy to take any other questions at this time, or we can move on if everybody is fully saturated with funding talk at this point.
Hey, Melanie, do you have a sense of how the funding for charter schools versus traditional schools, like what that comparison is? Because the comparison number you showed earlier was for charter schools in Memphis and Nashville, right? Not the traditional public schools.
No, that was for MNPS's district average as a whole, both traditional and
Okay.
public charters. And so there should not be a difference on the sort of, if you just calculate an average per pupil amount. Charter schools are entitled to 100% of those funds, less, whatever they may have statutorily required for an authorizer fee. So no, that shouldn't sort of vary between what a traditional, I'm going to say not what necessarily traditional student or traditional district school may receive, because the district may hold a substantial or not substantial portion of funding at the district level, rather than passing that through to a traditional public school, depending on services that may be offered. But the funding that is generated should be equivalent. And charter schools, again, receive 100% of the local per pupil funds, or local, state and local funds that are generated by their students.
Great, thank you for that.
I do also want to mention, I did not talk about this in sort of as among the direct allocations, but there is also additional funding It's about $500 this year, though it's subject to, could change based on appropriations, that goes to charter school students. So all of our students generate that additional contribution amount per pupil, whereas a traditional district would not. That's sort of taken the place of what used to be the Charter School Facilities Fund, which was a grant program. The funding that was previously used to fund that grant program is now flowing directly sort of as part of this per pupil calculation. Chair Carter, I think I am good if the committee is.
Well, thank you, Melanie. That was truly a lot of information. So thank you for providing UNTEST this TISA overview. Are there any additional questions from commissioners at this juncture? Well, there being none, thank you for all of you for your attendance and participation in this meeting of the Business Operations Committee of the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission. At this time, I would like to ask if there are any final comments. There being no further comments, do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Eddie Smith, so moved.
Second,
It's been moved and second. Hayden, please take the roll call.
Commissioner Smith,
Yes.
Commissioner Woodson,
aye.
Chairman Carter.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 3 ayes.
The ayes have it. The next meeting of the Business Operations Committee is scheduled for January the 25th, 2024. We stand adjourned. Everyone have a good day.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.